Hey my people, welcome back to Anime Forefront. This is Logan bringing you the latest in anime news, and today I decided to do something a little bit different. Instead of going over mainly anime news, I'm going to be concentrating on one thing specifically, and that is the Black Lives Matter movement and what's been happening in the US, and more specifically, what's going on in Japan and why this matters to Japan. And honestly guys, I intended to release this video yesterday, but I wanted to take my time with this issue and really do my research to kind of go in depth on this. So without further ado guys, let's jump into it. So as I'm sure most of you know, there have been massive protests in the United States regarding the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police, as well as many other cases of police violence in the United States that has sparked massive outrage. And like I said, what we've seen have been massive protests and even riots in parts of the United States, but also there have been protests that have been sparking up all around the world. Protests going on in Europe, Asia, Africa, all over the world regarding police brutality and how racism is treated both in the United States and in different countries. And Japan is no different. Last week we saw protests in both Tokyo and Osaka, which, if you don't know, protesting in Japan is actually really difficult. You have to go through a process, submit forms, so it's actually pretty impressive when Japan is able to muster a couple dozen people for a protest. But what we saw were hundreds of people taking to the streets. So it was really impressive and quite a show of force in Japan and how this topic is being regarded. Because the protest in Tokyo and Osaka wasn't just about the United States. It was also about Japan and how Japan treats racism. And it seems almost like clockwork that right before these protests, there would be an example of this type of racism in Japan. On one of Japan's national television agencies, NHK, a national broadcast was aired with a cartoon of the protests that was going on in the United States. Now this is nothing new for NHK. They oftentimes make little cartoons to depict events going on in the world, but what made this so bad was the portrayal of African Americans in this cartoon. And I gotta say, it was really cringeworthy to watch. What you see are African Americans rioting, looting, and just depicted in probably the most stereotypical way you possibly could. And it was actually so bad that the US ambassador in Japan commented on this video. It was met with a huge amount of backlash, rightfully so. And actually what we saw a few days later was NHK coming out and publicly apologizing after removing this video. But the point is, this kind of demonstrates a bit of the racism in Japan and really kind of how different races are approached. It's not necessarily aggressive or meaning any ill will, it's just a lack of tact and a lack of understanding. Now with everything going on with NHK and the Black Lives Matter movement in Japan, it reminded me of a story that you may be familiar with that involves Miss Universe Japan. Almost 5 years ago. Almost 5 years ago, Ariana Miyamoto was nominated as Miss Universe Japan, and it was a bit of a controversial move because there was a lot of backlash with people questioning if Ariana could be considered true Japanese because of her race. Remember, Japan is a very homogenous society. It's 95% Japanese, so the idea of race and nationality go hand in hand. And I personally think that if someone is born and raised and adopted into a culture, race doesn't matter. But then again, this is coming from me, who is an American from the Western world. So I realize I'm a bit of an outsider to this issue looking in, but it's sad to see an individual who's representing Japan and the country that they love with such passion judged so harshly purely based on the color of their skin. And very similarly, many celebrities in Japan have come out supporting the Black Lives Matter movement in Japan, including Kiku Mizuhara, Naomi Osaka, the famous guitarist Miari, Crystal K, and Naomi Watanabe. But one celebrity in particular, Naomi Osaka, who's probably one of the most famous internationally, has come under similar fire as Ariana Miyamoto, with people coming out questioning her authenticity as a Japanese citizen and if she should really have the right to speak on Japanese politics and society, and questioning if she's truly Japanese based on the color of her skin and her upbringing. So 5 years later, Japan is still in the same situation it was with Ariana Miyamoto, and it's sad to see. Naomi Osaka is one of the most influential and badass women of our age. She's 22 years old and rocking the world. And it's sad to see people coming after her in a country where she swore her allegiance to and to represent at some of the highest levels, just like Ariana Miyamoto. And to kind of wrap this thought up, I want to leave you guys on a bit of a ground level story that Asian Boss covered. A story about Micah, a half Japanese girl, growing up in a Japanese school and the prejudice that she suffered while going to school and growing up in Japanese society, and how sad it is. I mean, in America, we're raised on the idea that everyone is equal, everyone is the same, and if you're born in this country, you are American. But in Japan, that doesn't even enter the equation. That's not even addressed, and what's worse is it's treated as a normal thing. And to kind of wrap things up, guys, I want to mention something that might seem kind of obvious, but it's important, that the Black Lives Matter movement isn't just about Black lives, it's also about all lives and all the many demographics that have suffered prejudice and discrimination, which in Japan is also a very serious situation. On top of this previous story that Asian Boss covered, they also covered another story in regards to the Vietnamese workers in Japan and how horrible the situation was for them. In this story, Asian Boss covers a local temple that is taking care of Vietnamese workers and helping them with their situation, but also memorializes the Vietnamese workers that have been lost to suicide, overworking, or any number of issues. And in this temple, there's over 100 wooden tablets with names and dates on them of individuals that have committed suicide or died from work-related accidents or been overworked, and it is tragic to say the least. And this is a topic that I think that needs to be covered because, you know, the Vietnamese population, the racism that is described by this population, this demographic, it is violent, it is abusive, and it is destructive towards those individuals. In the story, you have individuals describing being denied pay, overworked, and ultimately being driven to a breaking point where they either commit suicide or end up going down a path that is going to lead them to some form of criminality. And in the story, you hear descriptions of people having cigarette butts thrown at them, not being able to rely on the police for support, being overworked, underpaid, and it's gross. It's upsetting to hear this. Because the racism I described before was kind of a soft form of racism, a racism that you can feign ignorance for. This is abusive. This is taking advantage of a people for economic gain or just to assert your dominance over them, which is completely unacceptable no matter where you are in the world. And it's in this regards that Japan finds something in common with the United States. While both countries are vastly different and on vastly different sides of the world, they both have a very similar issue with racism. So whether you're in the US or Japan, Black Lives Matter and all lives matter. And ultimately, everyone should treat everyone with respect and dignity, no matter where they come from. Whether they're Black, Asian, Hispanic, white, doesn't matter. Everyone deserves respect. Everyone deserves equality. So with that, Black Lives Matter. And thank you all for watching. Peace out.